The first is called Baclav's Inheritance. The library was dark. The library was closed. The library was as forbidding as possible. It was covered in ivy. Its books were walls. Knowledge was a raw material to keep people out of knowing. The caretaker arrived at dawn and looked for a way in. He started by examining the front door, which was entirely barricaded by Proust. Then he looked for cracks in the windows, which were mostly comedies of manners about people looking through windows. He ran his hands over the leather covers, slowly, slipping his fingers as far as he could into the bindings, just the way his father had taught him, and been taught by his grandfather. They'd been trying to get in for a very long time. After acknowledging again that all the windows were impenetrable, he went to the vents. The vents were made of the classics of post-structural criticism, and were different every time he looked at them. A few of the translations were poor enough to be loose, and he wiggled, then pulled, then threw himself against them, again and again. Someday he was sure they would break open, and there might be a crawl space to wiggle through. Tomorrow, he told himself, I'm going to burn the thing down. He said that fairly often. He assumed it was flammable. It was made of paper. Though in his secret dreams there wasn't even an ember when he doused it in vodka and threw firecrackers on the roof. He shook his head and went to see how his son was progressing on the tunnel. In a few more years, they might have a way into the foundation. His great-grandfather had bought the property from a Slovakian baron 20 years before the Great War. He didn't know much else, because his father and grandfather had told different stories about how it happened. In one version, great-grandfather was a hero, cleverly outwitting the nobleman. In another, he was a fool. He paused on his way to the tunnel to once again admire the slant of the ceiling, which was covered in tarot cards. Even from this distance, he could make out perfectly, despite 100 years of winters, the designs, the emperor, the hanged man, the devil. He had been lucky in the Great War. 2 of his great-uncles had been conscripted and sent to the trenches, where one had died of mustard gas and one had been cut in 2 by a machine gun turret. But they hadn't lost the land. The fighting had happened 80 miles north and 90 miles west, but not here. The roads had been littered with landmines, but not here. Everything had been quiet around the library. Not the second time. In the Second War, they'd had to cover it with swastikas because the damn Nazis had marched by. His father had talked about it the way someone talks about cancer, about a stroke. The SS had driven their cars just over that hill, and the soldiers marching behind them had shouted out deadly slogans, and everyone knew the Nazis burned books. For a moment, the world had stood still as the eyes of the unstoppable right looked over them. But they had not seen past the flags. The danger had passed. It had been his job to keep it safe from the communists, who claimed that the library belonged to everyone, then talked about knocking it over and using the land for a factory to make shoes. He'd been interrogated 3 times and put in prison for a year. But when he came back, they hadn't found a way in either. He smiled, his face crinkling like a vulture. He'd loved the library then. He'd loved the fact that there was something even the state couldn't crack. Back then, it had given him hope. Now, he wanted to crack it too. It was unnatural. It was mocking. He was sick of uncertainty. It puzzled him, terrified him, to think that many of the books of the library had been written while it was in his family's care. The post-structuralist works, for example, they had all been published while he was coming up with excuses to tell the secret police, explaining why there wasn't a secret key that would open the door, or why a rock wouldn't fly through the windows. These books, the ones here, had come first. There was, he was sure, books not yet published, in plain sight, if he knew what to look for. He shuddered, trying to understand this grotesque act of plagiarism. He saw that his son had stopped digging. It was not warm, but his shirt was off, his dark skin stained with sweat, his eyes closed. "Baclav," he said, "it's not yet noon." His son threw the spade down into the dirt. "Father," he said, "I'm done." "Are you sick?" Baclav didn't answer. They both knew what he had really meant. "If we keep digging, we can get under it. Maybe the floor isn't so strong." Baclav looked away. "I'll get you some water," he told his son. He turned around and walked towards the well. The young today. They had no sense of history, or of the sacrifices others had made for them. They had no priorities. They were easily dazzled by the things they saw on television, hypnotized by the idea of a better life. He turned the crank and sent the bucket careening down into the old stone well. His son was being lied to by the West, by America, which didn't have any buildings over 300 years old, which thought that power made them free. If they lived under communism, they would have known power does not make you free. The bucket hit the water, and a moment later it sank. He pulled the crank, so much heavier now, and began to reel the bucket back in. "Father," Baclav called. "Almost ready," he called back. He dipped the cup in the bucket and drank the water deeply himself. Then he filled the cup again and turned around. It was time to have the talk. Perhaps. Every generation had to get the talk, eventually. He hoped he could remember the words. He walked back to the tunnel, holding the cup. It was hotter out than he'd thought. "Pavel and Dmitri are going to start a software company in Prague," Baclav said, taking the water. "We can make good money with all the European companies outsourcing." "And the American ones," he mumbled. "That's right," said Baclav, sipping the water, then drinking deeply. "Good money." "And Masha is in Prague," he told his son, his voice hardening. Baclav looked away. "That's not important. You never really get over your first love." "I will." The father nodded. "You think you can do anything when you're young. You think that human nature is being discovered for the first time and history is just being written." These were the words. These were the words his father had told him, just over the hill, over his shoulder. The Iron Curtain was ready to descend. "There's a better life," said Baclav. "This," he gestured at the library. His voice trembled, his hand shook. He'd been digging this tunnel for 6 years. Almost a third of his life had been spent with a shovel in his hand. "This is just..." He looked away. "I can't do this anymore." "But you're wrong," said the father, "because the story is old, and already nothing ever changes. Do you understand? Whatever you do, the script is already written. If you go to Prague, you will not have any land. You will not have any family. You will be no one, starting over. And you will open every door and climb through every window, looking for something that will give you a place again." This was the talk. "But the insides of every building will be empty. You will walk through every archway in Prague and find nothing inside, because it has all been opened, and prodded, and explored, and mankind is still mad with grief." His son's eyes were wide. He gestured back to the library. "But not this. This is the only mystery left, and it has endured. Maybe I will not live to see it opened. Maybe you will not live to see it opened. But this is the only script we do not know the ending to." Baclav tried to look away, but his father was firm. "And the freedom you feel making choices that do not matter, unmooring yourself from an enduring mystery, they will..." He stopped. The father stopped. His mouth flapped open, up and down. He wiped his brow. In panic, he realized he'd forgotten the words. He didn't know how the talk ended. He couldn't remember. "Will," he tried to improvise. "Son..." He could tell his son was ready to weep. But now... "Baclav..." Now he could catch a glimmer of hope streaking back into his eyes. "Don't leave me, son. Your arms are strong. The tunnel could work." He couldn't remember how the talk ended. It always ended the same way. He had no idea. "Father," Baclav said, "the library will be here if I come back. If I miss it, you'll be here. You'll always be here, I know." That's not how it works." He tried to think, to clear his head. But Baclav put his hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry, sir, but my train leaves tomorrow morning. I will call. I promise." Baclav stepped away from the tunnel, saw that his father was going to speak. "Please don't make this harder, he said. He watched Baclav walk away then, walked back to the house where his mother waited, his mother who undoubtedly knew. He looked back at the library, and then at his distant son. This wasn't how it ended. He knew that. This wasn't how it went. There are some things that can't be changed. He just couldn't remember how it had to go. And now his son would have to learn it all over again. He looked back at the library, at the walls of Dante and Petrarch, the siding of James Joyce, the pavings of Umberto Eco. His son would have to learn it all over again. Generations would be lost. He shook his head and picked up the shovel. His shoulders already hurt. Maybe he could make it inside in time.